welcome back to the Deepfake Dialogues. Today I'm joined by Sam Gregory, Executive Director of Witness, an organization helping people use video and technology to protect human rights. We discuss how deepfakes are transforming the struggle to document the truth and ensure that authentic evidence is trusted. Let's dive right in. Hi, Sam. Thank you so much for joining me today. So I wanted to start by talking about the organization that you lead, Witness. What was the founding idea and mission, and how has it changed over time, and what do you do now?
Yeah, so it's good to be here. Thanks for the invitation. So Witness was founded in 1992, and it came after an incident of police violence in the US, the Rodney King incident, where a Black American was struck over 50 times during the course of a traffic stop by the LAPD. And our founders asked the question, what would happen if not only, in this case, the one person who filmed it, but many other people had cameras to show what was happening? And it was the dawn of like the handycam, which are these big clunky things you could carry around. And so the through line throughout Witness's history since we were founded has been, how do we make sure you can show what is happening in the most crucial situations? So crises, conflicts, human rights situations. And how can you make sure that it is trusted, believed, and acted upon? And so what that meant is and I've been a Witness 25 years, and I've led us through 3 transitions, right? That's the transition into kind of social media, the transition into mobile journalism and citizen journalism, and now the AI transition. And in each of those, the key thing has been, how do you support those frontline witnesses, who are the people who are there, taking out their cameras, trying to show what's happening? And sometimes they're journalists, sometimes they're human rights activists, sometimes they're ordinary people. How do you help them make sure what they show can be believed and trusted and acted upon? And for the last 8 years, we've been deep in the AI shift, which is, of course, culminated really in the last 6 months with this kind of challenging reality where we don't know what's real. So reality is that, knowing what's real in the current environment is very hard given the capabilities of generative AI.
Yeah, and so you were fairly early to the whole deepfake and AI concern, like before this became a mainstream issue in recent years. You raised concerns about this back in 2018. So what did you see coming back then?
Yeah, so in 2018, maybe sort of to step back even before then, in 2011, we started encountering, this was during the Syrian civil war, just so many photos and videos coming out of Syria, and often them being challenged. This is before synthetic content and AI, but people would dismiss them. People would recycle images and videos from one place to another. And so in 2011, alongside a group called the Guardian Project, we started building a tool it's now called Proof Mode, to help you prove whether an image was real or tampered with. And so we've always had this interest in how do you show what's real. And in 2017, I remember first starting to read about deepfakes and learn about them. And it became very visible that this was an accentuation of an existing problem, right? This was related to the issues of people don't trust the evidence of the frontline communities who experience human rights violations. Human rights defenders have, unfortunately, since the dawn of photography, been targeted with manipulated images, particularly women being targeted in this way. And so what we decided to do in 2018 was run, and I think it was the first set of global consultations on this, particularly ones that were focused on civil society and media, and say to the people on the front lines, you're not probably experiencing this at scale yet. It sounds like hype, right? Deepfake hype. But if you look at where this is going, how do you relate it to your existing experiences of distrust, gendered attacks, attempts to surveil social movements and human rights defenders? And what would you want to see different in the policy responses, the technical responses? So we called it Prepare, Don't Panic, because we were also concerned that there was a hype around deepfakes in 2018 that often exceeded the reality and was being used already to delegitimize real footage, right? You could just say it's a deepfake, and people were doing that in 2018 already. So we took this very measured approach of really trying to talk to communities, talk to social movements, talk to journalists globally, and say, what's the agenda that we should set as Witness for to try and shape this set of technologies in advance? Because the other lesson learned from previous waves of technologies like social media is if you're not there early, particularly if you're vulnerable communities, frontline communities, your voice is silenced. You end up being rules takers in a set of rules that weren't built for you.
Yeah, and so you brought up, the danger of real footage being dismissed as fake, and I do want to get into this because we know that there are 2 harms, when it comes to deepfakes, the implications of deepfakes for our information environment. So one is people being deceived. This is the more traditional, like, media literacy, harm by a convincing fake. And then on the other end is real footage that can now be dismissed as a deepfake. And how do you weigh these 2 harms against each other?
I think they're very linked together in an environment where they're often happening in the same event right now. And this is, again, the consequence of the last 6 to 8 months, where we've seen this acceleration in capabilities, access, realism, personalization, is even in the same context, you may well be seeing someone sharing a piece of footage in a conflict, say Israel-Iran, the Iran war, that is falsified with AI, but looks hyper-real. And then you have a real image right next to it or in the same day where someone is dismissing that as falsified when it is verifiably real, and where unfortunately, like, tools may give contradictory results, may say it is AI. And I think trying to work out how we deal, and this is the complexity that's happened and accelerated in the last, year, 6 to 8 months, is we're in a climate of ambient uncertainty where these exist next to each other. And I tend to think, and this goes back to like the validation of a lot of the things we heard from human rights defenders and social movements and journalists in 2018. They said, look, we've already experienced the dismissal of the real evidence. Like notoriously, Bashar al-Assad dismissed the chemical bombings as falsified in Syria. In South Africa, the Maracana, suppression of the Maracana protesters was dismissed. There's a long history of dismissing real footage as falsified that human rights defenders have experienced. So they identified that in 2018. I'm very proud of the human rights community because they were like, this is where this is going. And that may be as pernicious a problem as the falsification of the real is the undermining of the real. Um, and now we're seeing that pervasively. And of course, the challenge with what we might call these liar's dividend cases or sort of plausible deniability, plausible believability cases is it's trivially easy to say something is falsified, and it's quite hard to prove the opposite. So the benefit derives or sits with the person who lies and claims that something is made with AI, not with the person who's trying to discern whether it is or not.
And do you think that the public and policymakers have the balance between these 2, right? Or are they overemphasizing one of these harms versus the other?
I think that's a really great question because um, I think the hype around deepfakes for a number of years tended to fixate on the falsification of the real, right? And it tended also to be at the wrong level, right? So it tended to be fixated on how do you protect presidents and politicians and journalists, but not the broader environment. Um, my sense is that like some of the ways people are thinking about solutions and approaches and policy approaches, a good example would be like authenticity and provenance solutions, is trying often to address both with varying degrees of prominence, right? Like say legislation that really emphasizes protecting the real versus legislation that's trying to show, whether something is AI or has the presence of AI. So I think there is a nuance happening there. I think probably the thing that is important in this is we're taking it out of the realm of this is about high-profile deepfakes of public figures into what we're experiencing now, which is on both sides of the spectrum. This is a pervasive problem targeting a broad range of people, right? So, like in the case of non-consensual, intimate and sexual images created with AI, at the scale of millions and millions, particularly, as we saw in the Grok scandal. Um, but also in terms of how falsifications are happening in everyone's timeline and are being commercialized, to try and basically get our clicks. And at the same time that I think almost everyone I talk to at the moment has experienced doubt about something that they would otherwise have been totally clear was real when they see it. Either it's something that's really important to them because they have links to a conflict or a crisis, or they're just totally fooled by something in their timeline and they have a moment and go, wait a second, what is up that I had no idea that I was about to be fooled by that?
Yeah, and I do want to so can you, um, give us a few real cases that you and witness, more broadly have come across of of both sides. So one where authentic footage was waved away as AI, and also where there was fabricated um, media that was causing harm.
Yeah. So um, let me take some examples of the first. So the sort of the waving away of real footage, and I think this has got really complex because and I think the phrase the liar's dividend doesn't totally capture it anymore because I think we're in a much more complex environment where, let's take an example from Iran or the US. So let's say Iran. There was an example that my colleagues have witnessed, and we run something called the Deepfakes Rapid Response Force that provides rapid response forensic analysis for high profile cases, drawing on some of the world's best forensic experts who volunteer their time. Um, and you had a case in Iran of a protester sort of posed in a kind of tank man like image. If we go back to the Tiananmen Square, where someone lone person confronts, a militia or a paramilitary force. Um, it's a real image zoomed in on a camera, and someone then enhanced it with AI. And then people ran it through AI detectors, and it came back and they said, it's AI. So it's real, but people's attempt to make it clearer resulted in a false positive that it's AI. Similar examples that many people have seen from the Alex Pretty killing by ICE immigration agents or ICE and Border Patrol in Minneapolis, where people tried to enhance to work out what had happened, to identify the agent, and in that process created a face that never existed, a gun that never existed, right? And I think that's not the liar's dividend. That's just we're in a really complex environment where AI is being used to try and work out what is AI and to improve our understanding. Now, there are also cases where people are explicitly using the presence of AI to lie and relying on people's either cursory attendance or lack of understanding. We encountered a case in Ghana during the elections there where a prominent politician said something inconvenient in front of a crowd with a sign language interpreter next to him, broadcast on TV, and still said it was made with AI because he was sort of like, this is like a kind of magic pixie dust you scatter when you've said something you want to deny. So all of these things are coexisting in the environment. I would say on the where there are places where we see real fracture points at the moment around the ability to know what's real, which reflect also these broader problems about how the tools we have available to detect whether something is AI or not, which the general public generally doesn't understand and often give false positives and negatives when they use them. So, we've had a lot of audio cases in the Deepfakes Rapid Response Force. And a lot of the time there, you're wrestling with, a clip from, Hungary or Honduras where, it's highly contested whether it's real or not. And then you have to deal with the fact that detection algorithms may not deal well with low quality media, with Honduran accented Spanish or Hungarian. And that points to a fundamental flaw that I first talked about, 6 or 7 years ago, of the issue of what we call detection equity, which is this idea that detection just doesn't work equally well for everyone. And that is a fundamental human rights and equity problem that, I might be better protected when I'm deepfaked than another person purely because of my skin tone, my accent, my voice, and the fact that I'm speaking in, high resolution video. So how do we address that? That layer adds to all the complexity around how do we think about this landscape of plausible believability, deniability, and real fakes.
Yeah, and so you mentioned the rapid response force. So can you expand on what they do and walk us through what actually happens when a journalist
Sure.
contacts the rapid response force? Yeah.
So the deepfake rapid response force came out of a moment that I experienced in 2021 where I was asked to analyze a video of a leading Burmese politician who appeared to be confessing to corruption and implicating the Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi. And I, along with a couple of other experts, was asked to analyze it. And we concluded that it was a forced confession, that it was a real video, not a deep fake. But the thing that made very clear was there was very limited capacity amongst Burmese journalists and civil society to do that analysis. And the tools weren't well suited to do it in Burmese, right? It's not the obvious option to come to me to try and resolve that. It should have been something that a capacity and a resource that's closer. And so the Deepfake Rapid Response Force is part of a sort of two-pronged approach to how we've designed our work at Witness and how I've thought about it in this context, which is the force itself is a collection of some of the world's leading forensic experts in academia, in industry, in startups who volunteer their time to look at high profile cases. What will happen is typically a fact checker or a human rights organization or a journalistic organization will send in a clip that is starting to gain momentum, say, in their context, and where there is, contestation about whether it's AI or not. So people might be saying it's AI when they're pretty certain it's real, or they might be saying it's real when they're pretty certain it's AI, or they may have no idea. And then a team of those experts reviews it and develops an internal briefing. We have to have a certain minimum number of experts review something. Sometimes they disagree. Sometimes they're using very different methodologies. So in some cases, they're using machine learning-based methodologies to detect machine learning and AI results. Sometimes they're using conventional forensics. We have specialists who work, on audio only, others who are trying to think about biometrics. And so they'll take a look at it. We then provide that information back to the journalist or fact checker or human rights group for them to incorporate it into their reporting. So that's one side of how we think about detection. That informs also the work we do to try and say, look, we could just do better generally on detection because, as I've indicated, like those cases show those fault lines that it doesn't work so well globally, doesn't work so well on the media formats most people use, doesn't work so well in real world conditions, and isn't very explainable. It's hard to explain detection results to ordinary people who are already skeptical, including skeptical of experts and of media outlets. And so we developed something called the TRIDE benchmark, which is a benchmark for evaluating whether a detection tool is actually built in a way that will work for diverse populations in diverse settings and address this detection equity gap. And we've also worked on building data sets. So we sort of try and take a twofold approach, and that came out, building backwards to this experience of seeing that detection equity gap in real life in 2021 and only growing ever since.
Yeah, so you've talked about, the global majority problem and the detection equity gap. So so detection tools, forensic expertise, and policy attention cluster in the West, in the US and Europe, while some of the highest stakes manipulation happens in the global South. So can you expand on how wide this gap is and what can be done to rectify this?
Yeah, so I think the gap is on multiple levels, right? One is an attention gap, one is a technical gap, and one is a gap that is fully in control of many countries, nations to handle, which is how do you design good policy for yourself in a global context? The attention gap is one that we've seen before, which is that just as with social media, there's more attention to the geographies that platforms care about most, right? So if you're trying to think about how to build out tools that are as robust as possible for the global majority, often they will be prioritized less than the tools that would work best for, the high profile global north markets. And that is true, unfortunately, before, right? Like it's sort of an attention gap in terms of resourcing. The second is the technical gap, and that is fixable, right? There is no reason we couldn't have detection tools that work for um, as well for everyone as possible, right? And there are always going to be challenges with detection tools about access and adversarial usage, right? It's not like we can just have detection tools that just sit out there in the world. But there's no reason the tools we have shouldn't work equally well for me as they work for someone living in Bangalore, Jakarta, or Sao Paulo, right? Um, and so I think that's a technical one, and that's where we've really pushed as well, is to say, actually, probably from a commercial perspective as well, for anyone who's building these tools, if they work for more people, that's better, right? Like, we live in a world where even in a global north country like the US, where I'm based, we have a diverse population and a multicultural society. Um, the policy gap is an interesting one and kind of what governments can do themselves. Because actually, if you look around the world, you're seeing lots of different efforts by governments to sort of legislate and govern this. Um, and I think there are powerful approaches that are common to all of them, trying to think about transparency and the ability to know the presence of AI, to identify what's authentic, to have proper social media governance, because this is embedded in the social media world, to have proper AI company governance that any country can make a choice on. I think there are places where you see countries going backwards on how they're responding to the threat of deepfakes or synthetic content and relying on older strategies. A good example would be a number of countries, including India, where they're essentially trying to sort of create a content moderation structure that will probably be misused by a government to control speech. I think that's different from, say, the EU's approach, where you're looking at having, a consistent way that you signal the presence of AI in the content you consume and the communication you make. And it is non-judgmental, and it is not per se a mechanism for a government to control it or to make decisions. It's a method of transparency for the population to understand what is happening with AI, and for the government to look at aggregate and say, are people providing the right level of transparency on their communication and content as they develop tools and platforms?
Yeah, and something that I'm actually very curious about is, so we know that the vast majority of content that's AI generated on the internet is is like satire or entertainment. It's not malicious, but it can be, it can cause misinformation. Um, so I'm wondering how much of what the rapid response force has deals with is real, like, disinformation that's malicious versus things that are just, that may not have been created with the intent to deceive, but yeah.
Yeah, the whole area of satire, and in 2019, we did a report called Just Joking, maybe 2019-20, that was all about the phenomenon of deepfake satire, because it was clear right from the start that this was a powerful tool for parody and satire, right? Like, and that is an important tool of human rights expression. It is a powerful tool of the weak against the powerful. The title kind of captures the problem with it, is that also it's very visible that, like, the way people dismiss malicious, harmful, and disinforming content is someone to say, you didn't get the joke, right? I was just joking. And they share it. And of course, hyper-realism in content means if you strip context from content, then it is easy to go from it was satirical to it is to disinforming or malicious or harmful, particularly with the hyperrealism. The point of satire, and it's like when you read the literature on satire, is you should always know it's satirical, right? The whole point of satire is it's satirical, otherwise it doesn't work as satire, right? So there's a poor defense around satire when it's like hyperrealistic with no indicators of satire. Then generally, I think it comes from a bad faith position, right? When someone declares that. That said, right, like, when you think about some of the policy approaches around this, both at a platform level and at a nation state or supranational level, the approaches that focus on transparency and explaining what something is give people the option of sort of understanding that, right? So if you have, like, C2PA data in a video, you can see that AI was used to make something. It's not real. You can then probably make a judgment whether someone was just joking or trying to deceive you in a better way than at the moment we have. So I'm cautious about trying to restrict satire too much, because I think it is a tremendous weapon of the weak. I'm also hyper aware of how people use that just joking excuse and have that made even easier when they decontextualize hyper realistic content.
Yeah. And so are courts and accountability systems keeping pace or falling behind from what you're observing?
So I think we're on the cusp. That's what's really hard right now. And, I've spent much of my career working on issues around video as evidence, advising, international criminal institutions around how you think about these issues. And I think we're on the cusp. That's the problem, is like, as I say, it's really the last 6 to 8 months where we've had, the explosion of hyper realistic content at volume. And so, um, robust court systems deal well with, how you interrogate evidence, how you have, an ability to have forensic analysis. And high profile cases get that. One of the things I've learned from many years of working on this, and in 2012, Witness was a pioneer in developing the first guidance on sort of video as evidence, how you document it in, conflict zones if you were a citizen witness. And I remember we also had a report come out around then, and which looked at kind of how video was treated as evidence in a number of court systems in the Middle East and North Africa. And essentially, it was just like, it's the judgment call of the judge or the fact finder. He just looks at it and decides. That is not a robust system now, right? So I think you also have a risk of a distinction between local courts, global majority court systems, which still are catching up in some cases with video, versus, say, an international criminal justice institution like the ICC or the US court system. Um, and I think part of it now is trying to work out where you put the burden in a court system. Who has to prove it? Because what we're seeing already is liar's dividend cases, right? Notoriously, a number of cases in the US where Jan 6th defendants said, it wasn't me, prove it was me, about footage showing them during the assault on the Capitol, as well as genuine AI entering the courtroom, as well as these modifications, right? So take that example of the modification to the tank man image I was describing in Iran, right? That's a modification to clarify it. Like, in some sense, you want to make sure you don't exclude the evidence if that was the only thing that came in, because it's not materially changing the event. So I think we're in for a moment of complexity, and it probably will have that same equity gap and between different systems that we already experience.
Yeah. And now I want to get into provenance and authenticity infrastructure because you've played a role in helping shape provenance standards like C2PA. So where do you think they genuinely help and where do they fall short as of right now?
Yeah. So we came into the world of what we described as authenticity infrastructure in 2019. Myself and a colleague, Gabby Ivans, wrote a report saying, here are 14 problems if you're trying to build this infrastructure to show what's real and what's falsified. And so that brought us into this coalition that you named, the C2PA, the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, which has been developing one of these technical standards that helps you know, and we describe it often as the recipe of what's real and what is synthetic in a piece of content and how it was put together, almost like the sort of serving order of the food and the ingredients that went into it. Um, and you're right, it's now becoming increasingly mainstream. It's something that you see in OpenAI products, in Google products, in TikTok, in a number of other companies. And I think there are some strong fundamentals about C2PA, right? It's a set of data that provides information about the recipe, not just a binary yes, no, right? Because that doesn't help in this world. It's not AI or not, it's how to understand it. It also works for showing something is real. It can travel with the information and be reconnected. And it relies on metadata standards that are pretty commonplace, right? So it's not especially technically complex. And I think that's really necessary to be able to know the recipe. Um, what we've seen so far is that adoption in lags behind where it should, right? Like we need more political will by companies to make it work operationally between the companies, right? So it's no good if it appears in an OpenAI image but doesn't then appear when that image is shared on a Meta platform or a video created on Google, and then you share it on TikTok, right? That's hopeless, right? So the interoperability is a political will issue as well as a technical issue. And then most recently, and the place we've played in the C2PA is, and particularly with the leadership of my colleague Jacobo Castellanos, is to lead the threats and harms group, which looks at how this could go wrong and how to address it. And we operate, really trying to critically improve what we think is really necessary, this infrastructure of trust and authenticity. And he has a recent report out that looks at kind of risks of weaponization of this type of infrastructure, particularly concerned about how it could be connected to identity. And one of the things we've said and consistently is it's really important that you not make this a mainstream identity based system. There are certainly institutions that want to use identity, like a media outlet. There are artists and creators who want to attach identity, but you shouldn't premise this on identity. And his report makes a really good sort of analysis of how to make sure we don't connect the two too much. Um, and in the C2PA world, there are things that I, like for me particularly feel like, the sort of things that many of us have been working on for a long time. So, I mentioned earlier this tool called Proof Mode that we worked on with Guardian Project, to sort of show what was authentic and prove that. When I look at what you can do on a Google Pixel now, right? Like you can take out a Google Pixel and you can take a photo and show it was made with a camera and you can show how it was modified with AI. So, those kinds of places where everyone has that tool and can use it to me really matter because then we have a world where we have a lot more ability to both create and to discern use of AI, but also what is real.
Yeah. Yeah, and what I'm thinking about, like, how activists can benefit from this. It does seem a very positive thing where if they do use like the C2PA thing for whatever media that they're capturing, that does protect them from like false accusations of um manipulation using AI, and also from the liar's dividend issue. So what are there any reasons why this would not be a positive for activists?
So you're absolutely right. Like, and as I said, like, the origin story of my own work in this came out of trying to create a tool for activists and journalists to show what was real. Um, well before other people were building this, like we were building tools because that's what people we worked with said they needed. I think the places where risks come up, and again, this takes it back to my colleague Jacobo's recent report, is um, even if you don't have identity tied to your particular camera, there can be consistent patterns of how the data is shared to the cloud that could identify you in certain contexts, right? So it's not without risk, even if, you don't have identity tied to your usage of a tool. Um, we also reflect on what has happened in many contexts globally where you have a lot of rules about who can be a journalist, who can publish online, and the ways in which systems for providing provenance could be attached to that, right? So take an example, right? A country could mandate if you want to be a journalist, you have to use a approved C2PA device or a device with an approved, C2PA usage on it, right? So then you've kind of gatekeeped who can contribute and you've reduced, the ability to be a citizen journalist or an independent journalist. Um, so again, it's more about the nuances of how it plays out at a system level when the core use case, absolutely, the ability of someone to take out their phone and show what's real and not have it dismissed as AI is a fundamental need that hasn't changed.
Yeah. Yeah, and now I wanna get into, like, public education and what needs to change in this new era of deepfakes and AI. So how much should ordinary people be relying on detection tools?
Yeah, I not too much, I think
Yeah,
is the short answer. And it's because they are often they don't generalize as well as you would hope between different ways you create something. So, like, one of the things we saw over the last few years is people running tools designed for what were called GAN-based deepfakes. So the earlier generation of deepfakes made with generative adversarial networks, GANs, on stuff that were made with, later generative tools that use, say, a diffusion model or as their basis. And the tools, those two methods are completely different. So a tool to detect a deepfake made by a GAN will not necessarily detect a diffusion model based image. Um, and so the problem with telling everyone to use detection tools is unless they know how to use them, they're as likely to get false positives or negatives. And the problem is it's almost like a first mover advantage, right? Whoever gets
yeah,
the result they like most out of a detection tool, whether it's right or not, shares it online. And we see that all the time, right? So I don't think the answer from a policy level is let's have everyone have detection. The answer is let's make sure that when we have detection, it works as well for everyone as it could. Then you have to grapple with, is it right to make these all available to everyone? How do you protect against the impact that has on their reliability? So I think detection is complicated, but we could do better in making it work for every context at the very least.
yeah. And so I know that in the past, media literacy curriculums have included, like, visual cues that you can look out for, to detect AI generated content. But we all know that the technology is improving at a rapid pace, and these visual cues are no longer reliable. So, what should educators be teaching instead to build resilience?
Yeah, and I've spent a lot of my time over the last years telling people not to give the kind of spot the six-fingered hand, spot the, distorted hairline, which was, a thing before, because it dates so quickly and it gives people a false sense of security about their ability to spot it. I do tend to think, and I think there's a lot of research to do in this space because, media literacy is embedded in a broader culture of doubt around sources. It's also embedded in this kind of broader ambient uncertainty that AI has created that we're only at the start of, right? Where it's really not like, can I work it out on one thing out of 100? It's like might be 25 out of 100 of the things you have to do that. Um, So I think that's a caveat to say, as I think there's work to do to work out how we teach media literacy. I think the fundamentals are there. That you need to, I use the SIFT methodology: stop, investigate the source, find alternative coverage, trace the original, right? And it's still relatively robust as a methodology because it's trying to stop you reacting too fast, trying to think about context, and make sure you're not being deceived by something that has an easily traceable starting point. Um, I think one of the things we've got to work out how to do as these provenance signals, like a C2PA signal, get mainstreamed is work out how do we build in the kind of technical supports that hopefully will exist in a lot of cases to help people navigate it, right? So, in a SIFT methodology or something similar, how do you check the recipe and then work out whether it matters to you at all, right? That someone has used AI, right? And my sense is that 95% of the time, and this applies to my own consumption of stuff that I think is AI but don't bother to check, is I'm not bothered, right? I'm like, it's either entertaining or I can't be bothered. It's not important. So I think thinking about media literacy, but placing it in the context of the tools we increasingly have on the provenance side, not the detection side so much, is a really important step.
Yeah, and just to wrap up, so I know we've talked about the harms that may come from deepfake technology, but I also want to end on maybe a more positive note. So, Witness has also explored beneficial use cases, such as protecting witnesses' identities. What are the most promising positive use cases that you've seen?
Yeah, and I think there are, you know, a range of very broad use cases that we still don't know how to weigh them up on the positive versus negative usage. But like in the niche areas that are specific to human rights defenders and journalists, yes, the ability to blur someone's face in a way that is humanizing without stripping away their identity and their emotion is a really powerful usage, and we've done work in that area. We also have concerns that like AI makes it easier and easier potentially to reverse that blurring. So it's like it's on the one hand maybe easier to show, when you have a survivor or a victim who needs to be anonymous, but like the last thing you want to do is black out their face, right? That's dehumanizing. You have something powerful, but we still don't really know what the timeline is on the ability to switch that back. So blurring is one. I also think, and this is a reflection of the dynamics around, AI video storytelling, and I come out of a background as someone who made movies, made TV, um, that there are powerful ways when ethically done to show things you could never show: the inside of a prison, the context of a testimony, the story that wasn't filmed because a lot of stuff still isn't filmed, right, in the real world. I think the challenge there is um, those ethical uses may be largely outnumbered by the realities of just how the tools can be used for other things. So I'll give an example there that like I was at Google I/O this year, the big sort of showcase of Google tools, and they were celebrating the way that with the new generative tool you could generate, I think, 16 viewpoints on the same scene, right? And I looked at that and I was like, that's probably great for gaming, right? It's pretty terrible for the work of what's known as OSINT investigations, where you're trying to like compare different video sources to work out whether something real has happened. So unfortunately, I think the imbalance between what drives commercial development, like the bigger goals of AGI and world models, and the commercial side that drives these things like gaming and entertainment means that the priorities of people who are trying to establish ground truth and share that in a reliable way are less respected.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do wanna, just finally one last question. So, I know it's hard to forecast things, especially in such a rapidly changing world, but when you look out, 5 years from now, um, what do you predict will the information ecosystem will look like? Um, yeah.
5 years from now, goodness, I hope we have an information ecosystem in which there is more accessibility to information more broadly in ways that are meaningful and useful to people. I think that's one of the powerful directions of LLMs more broadly. It has to be an information ecosystem where we can reliably, most of the time, know what is real and synthetic and make that judgment without the help of an outside expert to help us do that, and where there are meaningful responsibilities on the companies to make sure that is possible 99% of the time. I don't think a world where seeing isn't believing all the time is a positive world. I think it is a world of of nihilism, and it perpetuates all the problems we have already about distrust and divides. So I think it's an absolutely critical problem that we set ourselves up for a future in 5 years where, yes, it's totally possible to create with AI, and yes, it's totally possible to know what is real and what is human.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much. So where can people learn more about your work and Witness's work?
Yeah, absolutely. If they go to witness.org, they can find out about our work.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Deepfake Dialogues. If you found this conversation insightful, please follow and leave us a review. It really helps get the word out. See you in the next episode.